turn, followed by substantive recommendations. So, can I first start by asking Councillor Arthur to address the meeting for up to, just remind myself, up to 15 minutes, if you need it.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, again. So, you asked a question directly, which one of us would respond to you, and I guess that will be me. Do I have any experience of being vulnerable or being bullied or having services shut down? No, I don't. Some of us will do, some of us won't. What I can say is that every single councillor in this room, regardless of the cynicism, regardless of the attacks, regardless of how many of you think we're just happy to implement Tory cuts, what I can say is that not a single councillor came into this room in order to cut services. We came into politics, we came into local government because we genuinely wanted to make our communities better, because we thought there was an important role that we could play in actually ensuring that services work for local people, that we recognise that local government has a role to play in helping people to live fulfilling lives, healthy lives, in communities that keep them safe. But the fact is, sadly, I come to this chamber tonight echoing the words that have been said already by other councillors and cabinet members, that the financial challenge that this council faces is unprecedented. We have cut £117 million out of our budget over the last 5 years. Over the next 3 years, we estimate to cut another 70 million. That's a 60% cut. A 60% cut. That is staggering. £6 out of every 10 will be lost by 2018 to 19. You do that to any individual, any family, and they will suffer because of that. It is nothing short of a disgrace, nothing short of a disgrace, that this wretched Tory Lib Dem government thinks that it's fair that places like Haringey, boroughs like Haringey, deserve a cut 7 times greater than wealthier boroughs like Richmond. That's £300 less for every Haringey resident because of what the Tories and the Lib Dems have done, despite the fact that Haringey is the 13th most deprived local authority in the country. Now, Councillor Coburn mentioned it earlier, and I do think it's important to restate this, to contextualise where we are. We were told that we wouldn't be in this situation. We were told back in 2010 that the austerity by the government would see that by 2015 things would be fixed, that the deficit would be cleared, despite the fact that Labour said back then that the proposed cuts were too far and too fast. We were ignored. And now we see the impact of your incompetence. Now we see, with £75 billion remaining of our deficit, borrowing £200 billion more than was planned, the slowest recovery for over 100 years, tax cuts for millionaires, whilst Haringey residents are £1,600 worse off. Now we see the impact of your failures. Two things should be clear. Number one, that the government's economic plans by its own criteria have failed. But secondly, that the austerity that we have seen over the last 5 years hasn't simply been about balancing the books. If it was, then the government would be doing much more to tackle the £100 billion lost every year to tax avoidance and to tax evasion, rather than attacking the welfare state. The government has used the last 5 years to essentially try and complete what Maggie started, to slash public services and to roll back the state to levels not seen since the 1930s. And sadly, local government has borne the brunt of the coalition's economic incompetence. Despite Cameron describing local government as, and I quote, officially the most efficient part of the public sector, its funding has been cut by 40% over the last 5 years. That's 70 million now anticipated for Haringey. That means Croydon anticipating another £100 million to cut. Hackney, £87 million to cut. Our local services have been decimated by the mistakes of the coalition government. Perhaps we should expect nothing less from Tories when in government. I certainly don't. But what is shocking, I have to say, is the complicity of their Lib Dem stooges. Councillor Elliott, perhaps when you give your remarks, you could explain how a party that helped to build the welfare state, the party of Lloyd George, of Beveridge, of Kings, in just 5 years has become the party of Thatcher.
You were all complicit in it.
What's remarkable is that even Tories, like Martin Tett, the leader of Buckinghamshire County Council, or David Hodge, the leader of Surrey Council, have hit out against the savagery of these cuts. And yet, what's even more remarkable is the complete lack of contrition from the local Lib Dems. No acceptance of responsibility. No acknowledgement that their party is complicit in making the lives of the vulnerable harder. No apology for the devastating impact their cuts have had on Haringey residents. Let's be clear, and I say this particularly after the nonsense that has been going out on Twitter, on your website this weekend, celebrating supposed victories over the Labour group in this council, that we won't take any lectures from Liberal Democrats, a party whose local MP is a minister in this Tory-led government, despite having positioned herself to the left of Labour for the last decade, a minister who voted for the catastrophic £3 billion top-down reorganisation of the NHS, who voted for the cruel and unfair bedroom tax, who pledged, with Nick Clegg, not to raise VAT on ordinary hard-working families, but then did just that, who promised to abolish tuition fees and then voted to treble them. And now we have the ultimate act of hypocrisy. Our local Lib Dem MP and our Haringey Lib Dems, who voted in Westminster, our local Lib Dem MP, for these cuts, for the £187 million lost by 2018 to 19, now with the audacity to come and campaign against them locally. Audacity so criminal that I would march her down myself to the local police station if she hadn't already tried to shut them all. Let there be no doubt that the cuts we face are Lynn Featherstone's cuts. These are your cuts. It's dishonest for you to portray yourself as concerned bystanders when you have done nothing to protect Haringey residents from what quite simply is an ideological attack on the state. So what do these cuts mean for Haringey? Well, sadly, there is no doubt that we are left with some invidious choices to make. As was said earlier, over the last 4 years, we have done everything that we can to protect frontline services. Adult social care has received a 4% cut over the last 5 years, compared to 42% cut to our central services. But when you have 70 million worth of cuts to deliver on top of 117 million, that's left us with little room for manoeuvre. There have been many criticisms about the budget consultation and the extent to which it has enabled people to engage with our proposals. I admit it's unfortunate that it's been so constrained. What we wanted to do was ensure that at least residents had the opportunity to engage with the proposals. Unlike many other boroughs, we presented all the information that we had. And I do say this, I thank the residents who have engaged with the process, and to ensure that people feel confident and comfortable about next steps, we will ensure that we continue to engage with residents as proposals are developed post the budget. There is deep cynicism about the extent to which the politicians within this room take the decisions that we're about to make lightly. I can assure you that we absolutely do not. Hearing and reading residents' representations during the budget consultation about the positive difference that the council has made to their lives has actually been deeply moving for many of us. In recent weeks, we've all received emails, letters, visits to our surgeries from residents who are understandably anxious and concerned and angry about proposed cuts to important and treasured local services. I can only repeat the point that Councillor Goldberg made back at the Cabinet earlier this month. To those who think that local government is a soft target, who think that all we do is collect bins and fill potholes, let them listen to the representations of the people in this room. Now, the fact is that when we are left with these difficult choices, unfortunately, we have to make difficult decisions when it comes to social care. 5 out of every £10 that we spend goes to the provision of care in this borough. which makes it almost impossible to leave untouched. We realise the value that day centres and residential homes provide, not only for users, but for the carers too. And what we do commit to doing, just re-emphasising what Councillor Morton said, is to make sure that we engage with user groups, and we will invest in advocacy, £20,000 to ensure that their voices are heard. Now, just quickly addressing how we approach tackling this financial challenge. Some have said that we shouldn't even go ahead with passing a budget. They say that we should simply refuse to do it. I have to say that I don't believe that is the right approach. To do that would simply mean that government commissioners would come in, they would slash and burn local services, and we were elected in a difficult context, in a difficult financial context for this council to do everything that we can for our residents, and I believe that we should take on that responsibility. Setting a 3-year plan means that we don't salami slice. If we do need to change our approach in a new financial context in which we'll be much more reliant on local sources of income, then it's important that we set forward how we're going to achieve that and think in the medium to long term. To only set a 1-year budget would mean that we would only be taking short-term measures, and I don't think that that is right for the residents of this borough. It's also, as was mentioned earlier, in line not only with 70% of London boroughs, but also 70% of Labour boroughs who have chosen to set a multi-year budget. And when it comes to reserves, we are using our reserves, 4.3 million over the next 3 years, in order to help smooth over the cuts, but they are one-off and cannot be used to tackle underlying funding issues. Finally, with council tax, some argue that we should just hike it up. But let's be clear, council tax is one of the most regressive forms of taxation this country has, disproportionately hitting the poor. And if we were to raise it by 2%, the amount at which, if we were to go above, we would have to have a local referendum, we would only raise £600,000, which is nowhere near enough to tackle that £70 million gap. So the easiest thing for us to do would be to passively administer these cuts and accept the decline of the council's capacity to improve the lives of its residents. But we reject that approach. We must refuse to simply accept that our borough must go backwards. Over the last 5 years, despite the fact that we have cut £117 million from our budget, we still have been able to freeze council tax for 5 years to help raise Haringey's exam results above the national average and to ensure that our parks, our green spaces, are officially among the best in the country. It's going to be even harder to keep moving this borough forward. But this budget, I genuinely believe, will help us to do that. We will freeze council tax for the 6th consecutive year in succession. That will save the council taxpayer in this borough £150 by the end of 2015 to 16, which is hugely helpful for those who are facing difficulties making ends meet.
But not for those who are losing their jobs.
At a time when libraries are being cut across the country, we have committed to protect all of our 9 libraries, and this budget will enable us to do that. In fact, it will enable us to invest in our libraries. A recent national report on libraries showed that 1/3 of people use their local library, and in areas of deprivation it's up to 50%. We know that libraries are treasured parts of our community, and we intend to keep them that way. We will spend £25 million on our roads and our pavements and on street lighting, making them safer for pedestrians, drivers and cyclists, supporting our businesses to move and to grow. We'll focus on regeneration, ensuring that, particularly in Tottenham and Wood Green, we can improve the lives of local people and lever in £1 billion worth of investment to create more jobs and build new homes. And although we cannot solve the housing crisis in Haringey alone, we're building at the lowest level since the 1920s, rents in London rising by 10% a year. We can still do our bit, which is why we'll invest £28 million into building new homes, why we'll spend £32 million to improve the quality of our existing council stock, and why we will spend £450,000 to create a lettings agency and a licensing scheme to protect private sector tenants. This is a difficult time for us, and as Labour politicians, many of us are feeling uncomfortable. That's absolutely right. We should be absolutely clear that the situation that we find ourselves in is not due to our making, despite whatever Councillor Engert may say, but due to the irresponsible decisions of the coalition government. But in spite of that context, in spite of that challenge, we will do everything that we can with the resources that are at our disposal to ensure that we continue to tackle inequality, that we continue to empower communities, that we continue to strengthen our borough as much as we can. All of us are here to make Haringey the best borough to live and work, and this budget will enable us to do that. Madam Mayor, I move the budget.
Thank you, Councillor Arthur. Councillor Coburn, can I now ask you to speak?
Madam Mayor, at this stage, can I formally second the budget and reserve my right to speak?
Okay, Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just wanted to respond briefly in the time that I have available to some of the proposals that have been put forward by the group opposite. I think the first thing that I'd want to say is that having listened very intently to what's been said, it does not in any way comprise any sort of alternative budget. All it does, if at best, is to tinker around the edges. It feels largely like an approach built on hand-wringing, a lot of hand-wringing, but little action. I guess the first question, the first challenge I'd put to the opposition is, if you feel these cuts are unjust, if you can see they are hurting the community, have you made representations to your government about the extent to which Haringey is facing these cuts and how unjust they are? I think the answer is no. Secondly, Councillor Connor spoke very passionately early in the meeting about the importance of the Roundway Centre. Having looked at your budget proposals, I can't see that there's a proposal that actually saves the Roundway Centre. There's a proposal around the Haven. Looking again at the easy target of talking about comm spend. But if everyone can think about the last time they walked up Wood Green High Road and saw the symbolism of what our comm spend is spent on, well, currently there are posters encouraging people to register their vote. The previous campaign was to encourage Haringey residents to become foster carers. One of the issues that we have in this borough is that we spend, not unlike many local authorities, £23 million a year on looked after children. We know that children placed with foster carers have better outcomes than often residential care, and it costs less money. So communications is not something that is simply about throwing glossy leaflets through people's doors. It has a whole range of very important meanings. I think the final thing that I'd say is I've heard very few things more ludicrous than arguing that we should spend more money on a bins contract by cutting the cash that we spend on staff, many of whom are working in social care services. That just isn't coherent. That's not a real alternative. And I regret that we're having that level of debate this evening. What we have in front of us are some very, very difficult budget decisions. We make no bones about that. We have consulted, we have listened, we have made changes. But what we are left with is a very difficult decision in front of us. I would say to colleagues across the Council that this is the best set of proposals we can come up with in the circumstances, and I urge you, therefore, to approve the budget as recommended by the Cabinet.
Right. I'm going to use my